One tank every hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 4 years straight. That was the production rate at the Detroit Arsenal tank plant at its peak. A 30-ton Sherman tank, complete and ready for combat, rolling off the assembly line every 60 minutes. Germany, with all its engineering genius and military tradition, never came close to matching that rate. At the height of their production, German factories turned out roughly 1 Tiger tank per day, not per hour, per day, and often not even that. This is the story of how American industry won World War II, not with better tanks necessarily, but with more tanks, an overwhelming flood of steel and firepower that drowned the German war machine, no matter how many individual battles it won. It's a story of assembly lines and logistics, of raw materials and railroad cars, of factories that stretched for miles and workers who labored around the clock. It's the story of how Detroit, the city that put the world on wheels, put the world at war. And it begins with a single speech that changed everything. On December 29, 1940, President Franklin Roosevelt addressed the nation in one of his famous fireside chats. America wasn't yet in the war, but Roosevelt could see what was coming. He needed to prepare the country for the industrial effort that would be required. "We must be the great arsenal of democracy," Roosevelt declared. "For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself. We must apply ourselves to our task with the same resolution, the same sense of urgency, the same spirit of patriotism and sacrifice as we would show were we at war." The phrase "arsenal of democracy" captured the public imagination. America would fight this war not just with soldiers, but with factories. The same industrial capacity that had made America the richest nation on earth would now be turned to producing the weapons that would defeat fascism. But turning that vision into reality would require the greatest industrial mobilization in human history. And the man Roosevelt chose to lead it came from an unlikely place, the assembly lines of Detroit. William Knudsen was a Danish immigrant who had risen to become president of General Motors, the largest corporation in the world. He knew more about mass production than almost anyone alive. He had helped Henry Ford develop the assembly line techniques that revolutionized manufacturing. He had built General Motors into an industrial giant. In May 1940, Roosevelt summoned Knudsen to Washington. The president needed someone who could coordinate American industry for war production. Knudsen took the job for a salary of $1 per year. He would become the most important civilian in the war effort. Knudsen's first task was seemingly impossible. The American military wanted 50,000 aircraft per year. At the time, the entire American aircraft industry produced only 3,000. Knudsen had to increase production by a factor of 17 in the middle of a crisis. He did it by applying the principles of automobile manufacturing to weapons production. Instead of having skilled craftsmen build each aircraft by hand, he would use assembly lines, standardized parts, and unskilled workers who could be trained quickly. The same techniques that had made cars affordable would now make weapons plentiful. The automobile industry was skeptical at first. Building cars was very different from building tanks and aircraft. The tolerances were different, the materials were different, The engineering challenges were different. Knudsen had a simple answer: figure it out. America's survival depended on it. The Detroit Arsenal tank plant was the crown jewel of American war production. Built by Chrysler in just 11 months, it was the largest tank factory in the world. The main building covered over 1 million square feet, so big that workers sometimes got lost inside it. K.T. Keller, president of Chrysler, oversaw the conversion. His company had never built a tank before. His workers had never touched military equipment. His engineers had to learn entirely new disciplines. None of that mattered. They would learn by doing. The first M3 medium tank rolled off the line in April 1941. It was crude by later standards, a hastily designed vehicle that combined an obsolete hull with a powerful gun mounted in a side sponson. But it worked, and more importantly, it could be built quickly. Then came the M4 Sherman. This was the tank that would win the war, not because it was the best tank, but because there would be so many of them. The Sherman was designed specifically for mass production. Every component was chosen not just for effectiveness, but for manufacturability. The results were staggering. By 1943, the Detroit Arsenal was producing over 400 Shermans per month. By 1944, that number had doubled. Across all American factories, Sherman production peaked at over 2,000 tanks per month. Germany's entire tank production, for all types combined, never exceeded that figure. Germany started the war with significant industrial advantages. German engineering was world-renowned. German factories had been rebuilt and modernized during the 1930s. German workers were highly skilled. On paper, Germany should have been able to match American production. It never came close. The German economy was crippled by problems that American industry never faced. Germany lacked oil. It lacked rubber. It lacked copper and aluminum and a dozen other critical materials. Every tank the Germans built consumed resources they couldn't replace. The United States, by contrast, had everything. America produced more oil than the rest of the world combined. It had vast reserves of iron ore, copper, aluminum, and every other material needed for war production. American factories never had to worry about running out of raw materials. But resources alone don't explain the production gap. Germany made crucial mistakes in how it organized its war industry, mistakes that would prove fatal. German engineers were obsessed with quality. They built tanks that were engineering marvels, complex machines that required skilled craftsmen to assemble and maintain. The Tiger tank was a masterpiece of German engineering, with thick armor, a powerful gun, and sophisticated mechanical systems. It was also a production nightmare. Each Tiger required over 300,000 man-hours to build. The Sherman required less than 1/10 of that. In the time it took Germany to build one Tiger, America could build 10 Shermans. German factories operated more like workshops than assembly lines. Skilled workers hand-fitted components that American factories produced with interchangeable parts. German tanks were individual creations. American tanks were mass-produced commodities. This craftsmanship mentality had real advantages in peacetime. German products were renowned for their quality, but in a war of attrition, quality matters less than quantity. A perfect tank that arrives too late is worthless. A good enough tank that arrives in time might win the battle. The Germans never made the mental shift from peacetime production to wartime mass manufacturing. They kept building perfect tanks while America buried them in adequate ones. America's secret weapon wasn't just factories and resources. It was people. Millions of Americans who had never worked in industry before flooded into the war plants, learning new skills and working shifts their grandparents couldn't have imagined. Women made up a huge portion of the workforce. Before the war, women had been largely excluded from heavy industry. By 1944, they made up over a third of the workers in aircraft factories and a quarter of those in tank plants. They operated lathes, ran welding torches, and assembled engines that would power the machines of war. Rosie the Riveter became a national symbol, but she was far more than propaganda. Real women working real jobs produced real weapons that real soldiers used to win real battles. The contribution of American women to war production is impossible to overstate. Germany, by contrast, resisted using women in industry. Nazi ideology celebrated women as mothers and homemakers, not factory workers. When labor shortages became critical, Germany turned to slave labor from conquered territories rather than mobilize German women. The slave labor system was not just a moral atrocity, it was also inefficient. Forced laborers had no motivation to work hard and every reason to sabotage production. Quality suffered. Output lagged. German factories never achieved the productivity that American plants routinely delivered. In February 1942, Albert Speer became Germany's Minister of Armaments and War Production. He was an architect, not an industrialist, but he had Hitler's trust and was given extraordinary powers to reorganize German war production. Speer achieved remarkable results. German war production tripled between 1942 and 1944, even as Allied bombing intensified. He streamlined bureaucracy, standardized production, and squeezed efficiency from a system that had been wastefully organized. But Speer was fighting against insurmountable odds. No amount of efficiency could compensate for the resource shortages that strangled German industry. Synthetic fuel plants could never produce enough oil. Conquered territories couldn't provide enough raw materials. The Reich was slowly starving. Speer later admitted that German victory had become impossible once America entered the war. The moment I saw the figures for American production, he wrote, I knew we could not win. They were producing more than we could ever hope to match. The numbers were indeed overwhelming. In 1944, American factories produced over 17,000 tanks. Germany produced fewer than 9,000. America produced nearly 100,000 aircraft. Germany produced about 40,000. And American production was still increasing, while German production had peaked and was starting to decline. The true impact of American production became visible in the ports and staging areas of England in early 1944. Ships arrived daily, carrying tanks, trucks, artillery, ammunition, and supplies in quantities that staggered the imagination. British observers watched in amazement as American equipment piled up faster than it could be unloaded. By D-Day, the Allies had accumulated an arsenal that dwarfed anything in military history. 11,000 aircraft would support the invasion. Thousands of tanks waited in English fields. Hundreds of thousands of vehicles of every type were ready to pour across the Channel. German intelligence tried to count the accumulating equipment and quickly gave up. The numbers were too large to be credible. Surely the Americans couldn't have that many tanks, that many trucks, that many supplies. Surely the reports were exaggerated. They weren't exaggerated. If anything, they understated the reality. American production had created a tidal wave of equipment that would sweep across Europe and drown the German military in steel. The production advantage showed itself in a way that statistics can't fully capture: replacement. When an American tank was destroyed, another took its place within days. When a German tank was destroyed, it was often gone forever. American armored divisions could absorb losses that would have crippled German formations. A division that lost half its tanks in battle could be refitted and back in action within weeks. German divisions that suffered similar losses were sometimes disbanded entirely because there were no replacement tanks available. This replacement capacity changed the entire nature of the war. German commanders had to conserve their equipment, using it sparingly and carefully because every loss was permanent. American commanders could afford to be aggressive, knowing that losses would be made good. A German general captured late in the war expressed his frustration. "We could win every tactical engagement and still lose the campaign. You simply had too much of everything. Every tank we destroyed was replaced by 2 more. Every aircraft we shot down was replaced by 3 more. We were fighting an ocean with teacups." American production didn't just outproduce Germany. They were outproducing the entire Axis combined, while simultaneously supplying all the major allies. The scope of the achievement defies easy comprehension. The industrial mobilization of World War II transformed America. Factories that had been idle during the Depression roared back to life. Workers who had struggled to find employment suddenly had more work than they could handle. The economy that had seemed broken in 1939 became the most productive in human history by 1945. The techniques developed during the war revolutionized manufacturing. Mass production methods that had been pioneered by the automobile industry were refined and expanded. Quality control systems that had been developed for war production became standard in civilian industry. The management techniques that coordinated the arsenal of democracy became the foundation of modern business practice. The social changes were equally profound. Women who had worked in factories during the war didn't simply disappear when peace came. The experience of millions of Rosie the Riveters had demonstrated that women could do any job men could do. The seeds of the women's movement were planted in the war plants of Detroit and Pittsburgh. African Americans who had migrated north to work in war factories didn't go back south when the war ended. The Great Migration, accelerated by wartime industrial employment, transformed American demographics and eventually American politics. The Civil Rights Movement drew strength from the wartime experience of black workers who had proven their worth in the arsenal of democracy. The story of American war production is often overshadowed by stories of combat and heroism. That's understandable. Factory work lacks the drama of battlefield courage. Assembly lines don't make for exciting movies. But without the arsenal of democracy, there would have been no victory. The bravest soldiers in the world cannot win wars without weapons. The most brilliant generals cannot execute plans without supplies. Courage alone cannot defeat an enemy that has more tanks, more aircraft, more artillery. American industrial might made victory possible. The workers of Detroit and Pittsburgh, of Los Angeles and Wichita, won the war as surely as the soldiers who fired the weapons they built. Every tank that rolled off the assembly line was a battle won. Every aircraft that took to the sky was a step toward victory. 1 tank per hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That was the rhythm of American victory. That was the heartbeat of the arsenal of democracy.